Imagine this for a second. When an empath gets angry, they don't explode, they don't scream, they don't try to win the argument. They change. And that change is the one thing a narcissist never sees coming. I'm not here to talk at you. I'm talking with you, like we're sitting across from each other having an honest conversation. Because if you've ever felt drained, misunderstood, or slowly pushed past your limits, this is going to hit close to home. Carl Jung believed that the emotions we suppress don't disappear. They become power when we finally face them. By the end of this video, you'll understand why an empath's anger isn't weakness, it's awakening, and why narcissists lose control the moment that shift happens. Stay with me till the end, because the last insight might explain a change you've already felt inside yourself but couldn't name. And if at any point you catch yourself thinking, "That's exactly what I went through," don't stay silent. Drop a comment saying, "I see it now." And if you want more conversations like this, the kind that actually make you think, hit subscribe, not because I asked, but because part of you knows you're ready to hear the truth.
When we talk about an empath getting angry, most people imagine emotional chaos, tears, or loss of control. But that idea completely misses what is actually happening beneath the surface. According to Carl Jung, every human being carries a shadow, the parts of ourselves we were taught to hide, suppress, or deny because they felt unsafe, unacceptable, or too much. For empaths especially, this shadow often contains anger, assertiveness, boundaries, and raw self-interest, qualities they learned early on to push away in order to keep peace, be liked, or protect others' feelings. For a long time, the empath survives by being understanding, forgiving, patient, and emotionally available, even when it costs them deeply.
But suppressed energy does not disappear. It waits. And anger is usually the moment when that waiting ends. When an empath finally becomes angry, not irritated, not emotional, but truly angry, it is not a breakdown, it is an awakening of the shadow. This is the moment the empath stops negotiating their worth. The shadow emerges not as cruelty, but as clarity. Suddenly, the empath sees patterns they once excused, behaviors they once justified, and dynamics they once blamed themselves for. Their anger sharpens perception instead of clouding it. Jung believed that the shadow, when consciously integrated, becomes a source of strength, not destruction. And this is exactly why narcissists never see it coming. Narcissists depend on guilt, confusion, emotional hooks, and the empath's tendency to self-blame. They expect anger to look like collapse, apologies, emotional flooding, or desperate attempts to be understood. But the empath's shadow doesn't beg, it decides. It brings assertiveness without apology, boundaries without explanation, and distance without drama. This is deeply unsettling to someone who thrives on control. The empath no longer argues to prove their truth. They recognize it internally. They no longer over-explain. They withdraw access. And most importantly, they stop feeling guilty for choosing themselves. That guilt was part of the shadow too, programmed, inherited, reinforced over years of emotional conditioning. When anger activates the shadow, the empath stops asking, "What did I do wrong?" and starts asking, "Why did I tolerate this for so long?" This shift is quiet, but it is final. Jung described this process as moving toward wholeness, and wholeness is terrifying to manipulative personalities because it cannot be controlled. The empath's anger integrates their softness with strength, their compassion with self-respect, their awareness with action. It is not about revenge, It is about alignment. The empath stops trying to rescue, heal, or fix the narcissist because the shadow reveals a hard truth. Some people benefit from your silence, your patience, and your pain. And once that truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. This is why narcissists feel blindsided. They are not facing the old empath anymore, the one who absorbed blame, second-guessed instincts, or stayed too long. They are facing someone who has reclaimed parts of themselves they once buried to survive. The empath's anger doesn't explode outward. It consolidates inward. It becomes self-trust. It becomes inner authority. It becomes the courage to walk away without needing the other person to understand. Jung warned that ignoring the shadow gives it unconscious power, but integrating it gives the individual freedom. And freedom is exactly what the narcissist loses when the empath's shadow awakens. The empath doesn't become cold, they become clear. They don't become heartless, they become whole. And in that wholeness, there is no room left for manipulation, emotional games, or guilt-driven loyalty. That is the true shock, not the anger itself. When an empath reaches real anger, something fundamental changes in how they relate to the world, and especially in how they deal with people who have repeatedly crossed their limits. Before this moment, the empath often tries to explain, negotiate, forgive, and emotionally manage situations far longer than is healthy. They believe that if they just communicate better, stay patient, or show enough understanding, things will eventually improve. But anger marks the point where understanding turns into awareness. An angry empath does not argue endlessly anymore, because arguing assumes there is still something to fix. Instead, they begin to enforce boundaries with a quiet sense of finality. This is not impulsive or dramatic, it is deliberate. The empath has already had every internal debate, replayed every conversation, and given more chances than most people would. By the time the boundary is enforced, the decision has already settled deep inside. This is why narcissists never see it coming. They rely heavily on guilt, emotional obligation, and the empath's habit of giving second, third, and fourth chances. They expect resistance to look like emotional reactions, tears, frustration, explanations, or attempts to be understood. What they don't anticipate is silence paired with distance. When an empath stops explaining, stops defending their boundaries, and stops responding to emotional hooks, the entire dynamic collapses. Boundaries that no longer bend remove access, and without access, manipulation has nothing to work with. The empath no longer feels the need to justify why they need space or why certain behavior is unacceptable. They are no longer trying to convince the other person to change. They are choosing to change their own participation. This is deeply unsettling for someone who depends on control, because boundaries enforced calmly cannot be negotiated away. The empath is no longer reacting, they are responding with intention. They may still feel deeply, but they no longer allow those feelings to override self-respect. This shift is powerful because it doesn't announce itself. There is no grand speech, no final argument meant to bring closure. There is simply a clear line that does not move anymore. The empath stops answering certain messages, stops engaging in circular conversations, stops absorbing blame that doesn't belong to them. From the outside, it may look cold or distant, but internally, it feels steady and grounded. For the first time, the empath understands that boundaries are not punishments, they are protection. Narcissists often misinterpret kindness as flexibility and empathy as weakness, so they assume boundaries are temporary obstacles rather than permanent decisions. When they realize the boundary is real, it's already too late to undo it. The empath has emotionally stepped back and reclaimed their energy. They are no longer available for guilt-driven conversations or emotional bargaining. This is why manipulation collapses so quickly once access is cut off. Manipulation requires engagement, emotional reaction, and availability.
Boundaries remove all three. The empath no longer explains why something hurts. They simply stop allowing it. They no longer wait for validation. They validate themselves. This is not about anger being explosive. It is about anger being clarifying. It shows the empath exactly where they have been overgiving and underprotecting. Once that clarity sets in, bending boundaries would feel like self-betrayal, and that is something the empath can no longer tolerate. What makes this moment so unexpected is that it doesn't come from bitterness, it comes from self-respect. The empath is not trying to win, prove a point, or teach a lesson. They are choosing peace over chaos and distance over dysfunction. In doing so, they quietly dismantle the power structure that once kept them trapped. The narcissist loses leverage, not because they were confronted, but because they were excluded. And that exclusion is final, not emotional. It is the calm decision of someone who finally understands that access to them is a privilege, not a guarantee.
When an empath reaches the stage of true anger, something very misunderstood begins to happen. They start to emotionally detach. From the outside, this detachment is often labeled as coldness, indifference, or emotional shutdown. But that interpretation misses the deeper psychological reality. Carl Jung described individuation as the lifelong process of becoming whole, of integrating all parts of the self instead of living through fragments shaped by fear, conditioning, or survival patterns. For empaths, individuation often begins through pain. They spend years emotionally connected to others, absorbing feelings, anticipating needs, and prioritizing harmony over self-protection. Their identity slowly becomes intertwined with emotional responsibility for people around them. Anger disrupts this pattern. When an empath becomes angry, it is rarely sudden. It is the result of long-term emotional overextension. And when that anger finally surfaces, it doesn't always express itself loudly. Instead, it creates distance. This distance is not punishment and not avoidance. It is awareness. The empath begins to realize where their emotional energy has been leaking, where attachment has turned into self-abandonment, and where compassion has been mistaken for obligation. Emotional detachment at this stage is not numbness, it is clarity. Jung believed that individuation requires separation from unconscious bonds, and for the empath, anger becomes the force that breaks those bonds. They stop needing constant emotional validation. They stop over-identifying with others' reactions. They no longer feel responsible for fixing, rescuing, or regulating someone else's inner world. This is deeply threatening to narcissistic personalities because narcissists rely on emotional dependency to maintain control. They expect anger to create chaos, guilt, and reconnection through emotional intensity. What they don't anticipate is that anger can produce independence. The empath no longer chases resolution or closure. They accept reality as it is. Detachment allows them to observe patterns without becoming emotionally entangled in them. They begin to see how often their empathy was used as leverage, how emotional closeness was conditional, and how their needs were consistently minimized. Individuation means the empath no longer defines themselves through the relationship or through how much they give. They begin to experience themselves as a separate psychological individual rather than an emotional extension of someone else. This is why narcissists feel confused and destabilized when an empath detaches. Emotional hooks stop working. Provocation stops producing reactions. Guilt stops creating compliance. The empath is no longer emotionally reactive, they are emotionally sovereign. This sovereignty doesn't come from bitterness, it comes from insight. The empath understands that closeness without respect is not connection, and emotional intensity without safety is not love. Detachment becomes an act of self-recognition. Jung emphasized that individuation is not about rejecting others, but about no longer losing oneself within them. When the empath detaches, they are reclaiming their identity from emotional enmeshment. They still feel deeply, but those feelings are no longer available for manipulation. They can care without sacrificing themselves. They can observe without absorbing. They can walk away without hatred. This is the most unexpected outcome of empathic anger, not emotional collapse, but emotional maturity. The empath no longer needs to be seen, understood, or validated by the narcissist to feel real. They validate their own experience internally. That internal validation is what breaks emotional dependency. Narcissists depend on being the emotional center of gravity. When the empath recenters on themselves, the entire dynamic shifts. The relationship no longer defines the empath's worth or identity. Individuation brings a quiet confidence, the confidence of someone who knows who they are even in silence. This is not an impulsive decision. It is the natural result of awareness integrating into behavior. The empath does not detach to hurt, they detach to heal. They no longer cling to emotional intensity as proof of connection. Instead, they value peace, alignment, and psychological stability. And once this stage is reached, there is no going back to emotional dependency, because the empath has crossed an internal threshold. They are no longer trying to survive emotionally, they are becoming whole.
One of the most destabilizing moments for a narcissist is when their carefully crafted persona stops working. And this shift often begins when an empath reaches genuine anger. Narcissists survive by controlling perception. They build a social mask that appears confident, charming, misunderstood, or even generous, depending on what the situation demands. This persona is not accidental. It is a defense mechanism designed to secure admiration, sympathy, and authority. For a long time, the empath may unconsciously support this mask. Their empathy fills in gaps, explains away inconsistencies, and gives the narcissist the benefit of the doubt. But anger changes perception. When an empath becomes angry, they stop interpreting behavior through hope or emotional investment and begin to see patterns instead of promises. Carl Jung warned that the persona, the social face we present to the world, becomes dangerous when it replaces the authentic self. It can only survive as long as others believe in it. Anger sharpens the empath's awareness and strips away illusion. Suddenly, charm looks rehearsed, apologies feel strategic, kindness seems conditional. The empath is no longer impressed by the performance because they are no longer emotionally dependent on it. This is where the narcissist loses their advantage. Their words no longer override their actions. Their image no longer cancels out the harm they cause. The empath does not need proof or confrontation. Recognition itself is enough. Once the mask is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. This is deeply unsettling for someone whose identity depends on external validation. Narcissists expect anger to be emotional and reactive, something they can manage or redirect. What they don't anticipate is quiet disbelief. The empath doesn't argue about who the narcissist really is. They simply stop believing the story being sold. Jung believed truth naturally dissolves false structures, and this dissolution doesn't require force. The empath no longer challenges the persona directly. They withdraw belief from it. Without belief, the persona collapses on its own. The narcissist may escalate, exaggerate, or attempt to regain control through charm or victimhood, but none of it lands the same way. The empath is no longer confused by contradictions or swayed by surface-level behavior. They trust their perception.
This trust is the true loss of power for the narcissist. Manipulation relies on doubt and emotional fog. When clarity replaces confusion, the performance fails. The empath doesn't become cynical, they become discerning. They stop separating intention from impact. They stop defending someone's image at the cost of their own experience. This is not bitterness, it is alignment with reality. Jung emphasized that psychological health requires alignment between inner truth and outer behavior. The empath's anger pushes them toward that alignment. They no longer need the narcissist to admit anything or change. Seeing clearly is enough to step away. The persona advantage disappears not because the narcissist is exposed publicly, but because it no longer works privately, and that private awareness is irreversible. The empath may still appear calm, polite, or distant, but internally the illusion is gone. The mask has fallen, not through confrontation, but through understanding. And when belief ends, control ends with it.
When an empath's anger finally rises to the surface, it often carries a meaning far deeper than frustration or hurt. It becomes a message. Carl Jung believed that emotions are not weaknesses to be controlled or suppressed, but messengers from the unconscious, pointing directly toward truth. For empaths, anger usually appears only after long periods of tolerance, understanding, and emotional self-sacrifice. It shows up when core values have been repeatedly violated and when inner truth has been ignored for too long. This kind of anger does not push the empath toward revenge or dramatic confrontation. Instead, it moves inward. It becomes reflective, grounding, and surprisingly steady. The empath begins to recognize that their anger is not about the other person's behavior alone, but about their own boundaries being crossed and their inner voice being silenced. In this realization, something powerful shifts. The empath stops looking outward for permission to feel, decide, or act. They stop waiting for understanding, approval, or validation. Anger transforms into inner authority. This authority is quiet but firm. It allows the empath to make decisions based on alignment rather than fear of reaction. They no longer ask themselves how their choices will be received emotionally by others. They ask whether those choices honor their values. Jung saw this as a vital stage of psychological maturity, where the individual begins to live from an internal center instead of external influence. For narcissistic personalities, this shift is deeply unsettling. Narcissists rely on emotional permission. They expect others to second-guess themselves, seek reassurance, or feel guilty for choosing differently. They anticipate anger to look reactive, emotional, or chaotic. What they don't anticipate is self-leadership. When the empath claims inner authority, emotional manipulation loses its grip. Guilt no longer steers decisions. Fear of abandonment no longer overrides self-respect. The empath does not need to prove their reasoning or justify their choices endlessly. They trust their internal compass. This does not make them harsh or unkind. It makes them grounded. They can say no without anger, and yes without obligation. They can walk away without hatred and stay without self-betrayal. Inner authority allows the empath to respond rather than react. They no longer feel pulled into emotional games or power struggles because their sense of direction comes from within. Jung emphasized that psychological freedom emerges when a person listens to their inner truth rather than conforming to external demands. Empathic anger becomes the doorway to that freedom. It reveals where the empath has compromised themselves and empowers them to stop doing so. This is why narcissists never see it coming. They expect control to return once emotions cool down, but this anger doesn't fade into compliance. It settles into clarity. The empath doesn't need distance to punish. They need it to protect their inner alignment. Their decisions are no longer negotiable through emotion. This inner sovereignty is invisible but decisive.
The empath may appear calm, even detached, but internally they are deeply connected to themselves. They are no longer led by fear of losing connection. They are led by respect for their own truth. And once this authority is established, it cannot be taken away because it no longer depends on anyone else.